The gentleman who said that I am denying the racism that remains in America, I wish you'd be a little more specific. What are we talking about here? Give it to me. Are we spending less money on urban education? No, we're spending more money K through 12 than public schools spend on suburban school districts, according to a study done by the Brookings Institution, which is left wing. Disparate rates of arrest is due to disparate rates of offending. Many studies, federal studies, have looked at this. I've told you that Eric Holder, the former AG, gave a speech when he was AG. And he said, America no longer is plagued by blatant racism. This was a time that Donald Sterling, the former owner of the LA Clippers, had been taped by his girlfriend making all sorts of incendiary, disparaging, if not racist remarks, lost his team. And Holder gave a speech around that time and said, when there's blatant racism like that, we got that. That's not a problem. So here you have the AG of America saying blatant racism is not a problem because we got that. Then he went on to what he said was the problem. We've talked about this before, but on this day, the 100th anniversary of Tulsa, where Joe Biden gives a speech about systemic racism, it's relevant. He then proceeded, Eric Holder, to outline the three examples of what he called pernicious racism. His term, not mine. Example number one, he said the push for photo voter ID. He considered that to be racist, a suppression of the rights of blacks to vote. Problem with that argument is the majority of blacks want photo voter ID. Now, how is it that something that Eric Holder deems to be racist is supported by the majority of blacks? Second example, Eric Holder said that a black criminal defendant who commits the same crime as committed by a white criminal defendant gets a longer sentence, and that is true. What he didn't tell you is that the U.S. Sentencing Commission, which came up with that finding, also said that the reason for the finding is that the average black criminal has a longer conviction record compared to the average white criminal, and that record is taken into consideration upon sentencing, and that is why the black criminal defendant gets a longer sentence. Are black judges giving black criminal defendants shorter sentences? No. And the third thing that Eric Holder said is that black boys were disproportionately kicked out, expelled, punished, disciplined compared to other races in that given school. And that is also true. And Jesse Jackson, making that argument some years ago, sued the then all-white school board of Decatur, Illinois, because that school board had kicked out a bunch of black kids that were fighting after a football game. Jesse Jackson considered that to be racist, filed a lawsuit accusing the all-white school board of engaging in systemic racism. And the judge threw it out, noting that all around the country, irrespective of the race of the school board, irrespective of the race of the principal, irrespective of the race of the teacher, black boys were kicked out disproportionately compared to other races in that given school. Maybe, just maybe, it's behavior. Now, when a kid like the gentleman we talked about last week who goes to Northwestern writes a piece published in the school newspaper about how when he walks around campus, he notices that white people don't get out of his way, and he spoke to other black kids who are on that campus, and they confirmed to him that they feel the same way. You really believe 18, 19, 20-year-old liberal white kids are refusing to get out of the way when black kids are walking by because they're racist? If that's how far you have to dig to find something racist in America, we're probably doing okay. Now, Barack Obama gave an interview to the New York Times. And before I tell you what he said, I want to tell you a story about a baseball player named Barry Bonds. Barry Bonds was an extraordinarily good baseball player. A lot of people felt he was a little insensitive. So he's in the locker room one time, going through probably the worst slump of his career. He rarely had slumps. This one was a bad one. And he was sitting there, and he was complaining. And every baseball team has the 25th guy, barely hanging on. He's just there because they need a utility guy that can do lots of different things, barely surviving to remain in the league. And he was in the locker room with Barry while Barry was just going on and on about how he just couldn't get a hit. And the guy that was listening is the guy that's just barely hanging on, as I mentioned, barely hitting enough to even survive in the major leagues. And so as Barry's going BMW about all his inability to get a hit, he looks up, he sees a guy looking at him. And he stops. And he has an epiphany. And Barry says to the guy, "You must feel like this all the time. How do you deal with this?" Barry, completely oblivious to how insulting that sounded to the guy. That's how Obama sounded in this interview. Completely tone deaf, completely oblivious. I will explain when I come back. 888-971-SAGE. I am Larry Elder.